Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today, I am joined by Frank Mastrobuono from GSI, and you are the VP Sales there, I believe, Frank. So how are you doing today?
And dude, I'm doing well. Thank you very much, Kevin, for having me on. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Awesome. So I think we're gonna have lots to talk about. I was looking at your LinkedIn profile. We were just talking about like how did I reach out and want to chat. So I believe you were just joking about travel, how crazy it could be. So tell me about the recent whirlwind road trip that way, this way, and where we're reaching you today.
Yeah, so was at the Society of American Foresters annual convention. It sounds like that's how kind of Kevin got wind of myself and ultimately caused him to reach out. So good to know that, the conversations at the conference or the presence at the conference has at least gone somewhere already. So that was just a couple weeks ago. We actually gave a presentation at the Innovation Zone, just kind of a quick little overview of the technology that GSI utilizes. And from there, I got back on the road and went to a conference, the National Association of State Foresters annual conference in Providence, Rhode Island, my home state. And that's where I currently am. And I did actually used to live out in Colorado, though. So it was like a nice little visit back to a place that's very special to my heart.
Yeah, good. Went back to the old stomping grounds and see what's changed and what maybe hasn't changed. So very cool. So definitely, thanks for joining. I know I always start these podcasts with talking to the guest about their journey, and I'm going to do a head scratcher here because help me out. Like emergency medical technician, I think at one point, then entrepreneur, founder, startup, and then like walk me through this thing. I'm trying to understand. Fascinating. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I'm like, wow, this is going to be an interesting story from Frank about his journey to where you are today versus where you started. So maybe for our listeners, give us an overview of environmental science, and then this journey, this trajectory to where you are.
Yeah, I can give you the overview. It's not wasn't exactly the most linear trajectory. That's true. And I guess I'll tell you about that. But yeah, I actually started my undergraduate career at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And I was a lifeguard kind of growing up and was always kind of interested in medicine potentially as a career. And when it came time to really basically choose a major my freshman year, I maybe was of the camp that I'm 18 years old. What do I know about what I want to do for the rest of my life right now? And I think, I ultimately decided that maybe I wanted to keep the door open to medicine, but I had some other passions. And, I grew up in Rhode Island, was just, playing in the woods and at the beach here, growing up. And, nature just always fascinated me. I had a book growing up called A Guide to Rhode Island's Natural Places. I was like really young when I had that. I wanted to go to all these places and understand them. So I decided that, environmental science was something that could keep the door open to medicine because I would be filling all those prereqs and still studying something that was interesting to me. And it started there. And ultimately, I did a semester abroad. And that's when I arranged to transfer to the University of Rhode Island. A number of different reasons. I probably was happier at a bigger school. I was looking at the course offerings when I was transferring and seeing that URI had a really technical program and St. Joe's was a liberal arts school. Um, and then kind of all throughout this time, I was still exploring the whole medicine aspect. I was an EMT that I got my certification while I was in Philly and kept up with it when I was in Rhode Island and even actually after graduation for a bit. But so I had a really positive experience studying abroad and loved it and came back to University of Rhode Island after that. And that's where I really got into the technical aspect of environmental science. It was a BA program at St. Joe's and a BS at URI. URI was doing pretty well in the rankings for that program at that point. And, I was in state, so it meant I could pay in-state tuition. So, uh, yeah, I got a BS in environmental science and management. And I graduated in 2009, right at the height of the financial crisis. So the job market was really tough, especially in environmental science. I had pretty strong course offerings in forestry and in wetland ecology. So, kind of anything that fit within that realm, like you're just frantically applying to whatever you could. Eventually, a local nonprofit got a grant to do a project with the U.S. Forest Service and the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And, I applied for that job and got it. And it was probably about 6 months of waiting tables before that happened. But yeah, then I was out collecting tree inventories in Rhode Island. And that was really my first foray into forestry. It wasn't um, I was more focused when I was applying on wetland type jobs because they were readily available. There's a lot of demand from, real estate needing to delineate wetlands. And yeah, I basically from there, the urban forestry position at the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management was open. I took that job and I was there for quite a bit. And really, I think that I had a number of experiences throughout my career, and also, graduating at the height of the 2009 financial crisis that just told me an MBA was really what I wanted. Essentially, you can be really good at doing science, but leading an organization or a group of people to do science, that's a totally different set of skills. And that was something that I recognized that I wanted for myself. And so I think also uh, graduating at the height of the financial crisis, I was curious about what were the conditions that predicated that, and how could I learn about them so as to not participate that in my career in the future. So those were really the two main factors. And, getting an MBA from an environmental science education, it's like kind of a pivot. And even I was like really scared that I was going to have to rectify this kind of, you know, let's tear up the system attitude with what I was going to learn in an MBA program. And actually, to my pleasant surprise, it wasn't. It wasn't something I had to do. I, learned that, well, trickle down was never really a thing. A business needs to think of itself as part of an ecosystem and do its best to take care of that ecosystem in order for everyone to be happy. We're not talking about maximizing shareholder returns. We're talking about maximizing stakeholder value. Two very different approaches. But that was also an international school, Hult International Business School. I visited a bunch of schools. I mentioned I had a really positive experience studying abroad, and I just wanted that as part of my master's education. So Hult was my Boston campus was 250 students representing about 72 countries, something like that.
Wow.
And it was a truly amazing experience. I learned just as much from my fellow classmates than I did from the professors. And a bit of it too was alongside the traditional MBA curriculum, there's a focus on soft skills and just kind of like navigating dynamics in an organization, how to be effective. And that was a really valuable part of my education. It wasn't something that, anybody had even introduced to me as a concept that you could formally educate yourself on.
Yeah, yeah. And
Uh,
was forestry still kind of in the background of your thinking while you're doing your MBA? Like you had an idea maybe you're going to come back, or it was really still kind of broaden my horizons or broaden Frank's horizon so I could figure out, where I want to kind of hang my hat on or focus?
yeah, I think that, at this point, I had kind of figured out that I'm really passionate about applying advances in technology to management of natural resources, whatever that might be.
Wait, wait, wait. And you
And
chose forestry?
well,
We'll get into that one after, but
yeah,
carry on. I just had to insert
sure,
that
yeah,
little comment there. So,
totally fair. Um, so yeah, it was a journey. It was a year-long program. It was really intense. I spent 2 months in China, and I all the time, yes, obviously was thinking about what the end goal was. And some sort of blend of I think I had worked also at this point in private industry and nonprofits and in government. And really, even when most of those types of organizations want to do something cool or something innovative, there's a private company that's coming in as a contractor. And, I wanted to be participating in that kind of frontline environment. And that was something that I knew during my MBA. Exactly how that would apply, I wasn't sure. So yeah, Earthly came out of that's a venture that I worked on for a few years. Um, that came out of the MBA program. Basically, as part
Oh,
of our program, we had a business challenge or an impact challenge, and you could choose different tracks. And the track that I chose and my team chose was social entrepreneurship. And basically, as an exercise, you're starting with a world problem and trying to find a financially sustainable business model that can effectively address that problem. And after much deliberation, my team decided upon food waste, something that was something that we could all be passionate about, something we all get behind. And, it just started at, well, the vast majority of food waste is produced in cities and it's trucked outside. So what can we do to potentially deal with that? It's trucked outside because the land area needed to process it is vast. So it's more economically feasible where that land is cheaper. And then, it's just kind of like this string of yarn that you start pulling. And ultimately, we said, okay, worms will compost food waste faster than the composting process. It can be done indoors. So, this would be something viable in a warehouse. And we just started collecting food waste from kind of local businesses and feeding those to worms. And it was kind of like jumping off a cliff and building a parachute on the way down, which I probably wouldn't recommend to anybody.
yeah,
But
yeah. But there's a
um,
connection beyond the worms because when I was looking at the description, I was like, worms, really cool. Then I was like, cannabis. I'm like, wait, wait, are these edible worms or what are we talking about now? And so bring me up to speed. I was like, there's got to be a cool, more than
yeah.
just worms composting away food waste.
Absolutely. And, this was right around the time that Massachusetts was, putting legalization on the ballot. And we didn't come into it with the intention of selling this product in the cannabis industry. It has applications, widely, agriculture. It's just that it's an expensive product and it makes sense to use it on high dollar value cash crops. And really, when we did our research, we found that cannabis growers were tuned into the product and understood its value. So they were the problem aware and solution educated market. And, you know, we did have some of our worm castings that went to agricultural operations, but it was just that the vast majority of the accessible market was in cannabis. And, at the same time, uh, typically most of the growers are that are purchasing worm castings are living soil oriented, maybe a little bit on the organic side. Um, Living organic is, that those folks are just trying to seek out the most craft worm castings possible. It's like a craft beer community, but with the worm
Yeah,
castings.
yeah,
So yeah, we kind of were you have a mentor through this program and they're kind of walking you through the process of this, finding a product market fit.
yeah,
And I can remember we had the meeting with one of the founders of Mass Challenge was our mentor. And we kind of had a conversation with some other people that were producing worm castings and then ultimately some cannabis growers and kind of told the story about how they're that educated, aware market. And, he just said, well, this sounds a lot like product market fit. So again, it wasn't like I was had a job right out of my MBA program. This was something that was on the table, and I actually had a couple professors that were really encouraging and just saying, you should go ahead with this and see what you
yeah,
can do.
yeah. Try it out.
And yeah, and I don't think that at that point I understand what that meant from a personal perspective. This was like right at that there was a lot of venture capital money that was
Mm.
flying around at this point in time. The kind of hustle culture was, really up and coming and really loud. And running a business is hard. It's really hard, and it affects many different aspects of your life. And
I feel like
yeah,
all the foresters, the contractors, the landowners, whoever that are listening to this, they're all probably all sitting there nodding, going, yeah, like hell yeah, it's hard to run a business. It doesn't matter if it's just forestry, it's any business, period. So
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So obviously, yeah, that business, MBA post project ran it for a few years. Clearly, you exited for what, like eight, nine figures, right? Because it's cannabis and worm castings, right? And then your journey went on further to maybe more the GIS side. I'm saying that jokingly in case our listeners are going like, really? Like Frank's like, eight, nine figure exit. And I suspect that's not the case, but I
No,
assume,
I wish.
yeah. And then you move
I
forward. I
wish.
think you got into the GIS space, right?
Yeah, basically, it got to a point where, in order to scale a production like that, there's more technology that needs to be developed, and that may be something that we might do someday. But I was doing a lot of physical labor. That is tough too, and I just kind of decided that I didn't want to drive a tractor for the rest of my life or kind of work in a warehouse. And the time to make a move, basically, I had a someone that I met when I was the urban forester for the state of Rhode Island, Ian Hanau, the CEO of Planet Geo. I saw that their company was hiring. I reached out, and it was a pretty natural fit. And that was drawing on my urban forestry experience and kind of now coming in from the business side of things in that market was really interesting to me, actually. And I started kind of this really general title as a business developer. And it was just kind of looking at there was sales. Pretty much everyone in the company did sales, but also a degree of marketing, a degree of taking feedback from conversations with clients and even prospective clients and saying, well, hey, like I have this client that's facing XYZ problem. I think there's a couple of workflows in the software that could potentially help them with that, but I just want to make sure, and maybe there's a couple things that need to be tweaked, and maybe with just a few more features added, we'd be able to serve people with this problem a little bit better. And that part of it was really cool. It was also an extension of some of the like real values driven stuff that I had
Hmm.
experienced earlier on in my career, the ecological benefits that trees provide in urban areas and their impact on public health. And there were clients of Planet Geo that, were performing canopy studies and uh, are looking at the presence of tree canopy in different census block groups and how does that correlate with other demographic factors with data from like CDC places, childhood asthma rates. Probably not a big surprise, but uh if you live in an area with low tree canopy cover, then you also likely live in an area that's lower than median income, higher uh presence of ethnic minorities, um and higher childhood asthma rates. So Planet Geo has a tool that allows uh, city managers who may have an urban forestry budget to prioritize different census block groups in their planting plan based upon these priorities. And we could bring in any sort of data into the software that was urban heat islands, anything really, so long it was geographically referenced. And then, they could really design a comprehensive plan and maybe even look at many different scenarios. And then also it gave them a tool over time to watch the progress. And that was really cool and really rewarding. Um, but I worked kind of in sales, kind of doing a lot of work feeding back and forth to the marketing team and the tech team, and ultimately kind of moved up to be the international sales director. So Planet Geo has a network of partners all around the world. Um, and those are all kind of the local representatives and the local industry folk that help clients out. And I kind of got to work with all of our international partners for a while. I traveled all around. It was really cool. Just really understanding the different dynamics of uh, the built environment and the interface between people's lives and the environment all around the world.
Yeah, and obviously you decided to expand your horizons further to the spaceborne level now as I think about it with global surface intelligence. So maybe introduce us to who GSI is, what they are, what they're doing. When we were talking before the recording started, I've been familiar with GSI from many years ago, I believe, headquartered in Edinburgh. Scotland, international preference, but maybe give us an overview of who GSI is, their history, and what problem you folks are trying to solve.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'd always been at the intersection, or there had, even in my early work, there was an intersection of remote sensing and forestry. And I was in my undergrad collecting data on a clipboard in the middle of a forest, and also doing an analysis on that same piece of property using data in ArcGIS. And maybe I kind of was at this unique time where technology was really starting to being folded in, at least to the academic side of the industry. And there was remote sensing elements in the project right out of undergrad, and especially obviously at Planet Geo, and even when I was the urban forester at the state of Rhode Island. And the so it's kind of like using data from space to determine features in the environment, really fascinating to me. It has been all along. And between Planet Geo and GSI, I was working at a company called Context Labs. Their basically aim is to increase the confidence in decarbonization data. And it's really accomplished by multiple sources of data, all being ingested securely, looking at the same things, making sure that they're all pretty much telling the same story. So even then, there was a remote sensing aspect there. And, someone reached out to me about GSI while I was there. And, I personally hadn't heard of GSI then. And once I really started to learn what the company does, that's when I became more and more interested. And GSI, yeah, essentially the long and short of it is that GSI helps anyone in the forestry industry by providing data similar to LiDAR surveys, plus the addition of species composition at about 30% of the cost. I think if you remember nothing else about GSI, that's really what the company is committed to doing. And GSI does this through a technique called time series analysis. And the difference between time series analysis and other remote sensing methods is with a traditional remote sensing analysis, we're looking at one image, typically sometime around the height of the growing season for the year in question. And we are segmenting the forest in that image by the way that they look in that image. That could be, NDVI or anything, many parameters. And with time series analysis, what we're doing is we're actually stacking up as many viable images from the same source at over the course of the year. The only real factor there is the revisit time of the satellite constellation, and Sentinel-2 is the one that is part of our core approach, and that's every 5 to 6 days. And then after that, it's cloud cover. And what we're doing is we're getting this dense sequence, this dense time series of images, and watching each pixel's evolution over time. We're watching the evolution of the spectral signature, which I guess, maybe now we're getting a little technical. And, essentially there's many different sensors on the satellite, red, green, blue, near infrared, so on and so forth. And the intensity of each wavelength of light is being measured with every photograph. And so if we can plot each of those wavelengths of light in each pixel over the course of time, the way that each pixel evolves over time tells us a little bit about what's in it. And that's how we get species composition. So GSI really does this with the aid of supercomputers. And that's because this is, as you can imagine, a pretty processing power intensive operation. It might take a traditional computer 30 days to effect a time series analysis. Using a supercomputer, we can condense that into hours. So there is a machine learning component to it. And the supercomputer not only allows us to process large amounts of images in a sequence, but it also can enable us to do that at very wide scale. So there is a real true economy of scale in what GSI is doing using time series analysis, providing or making analyses on hundreds of thousands to millions or maybe even tens of millions of acres accessible economically. Now, the caveat is there's absolutely a higher fixed cost to this type of analysis. But when we're looking at larger areas, it's definitely way more cost effective than other methods and provides pretty highly accurate data. In a project that we delivered just over the course of the past year in northern hardwoods in the United States, pretty complex, uneven aged, uh, mixed management type forest, overstory, understory potentially. We were able to have 95% confidence interval plus or minus 5%. And we were able to do that on 700,000 acres. So pretty big scale, pretty high accuracy in terms of species predictions, and we'll predict 3 dimensions: species size and density. And that's basically 3 individual raster images that then get combined into a stand map, which is a polygon. And then we're building an operational forest inventory that can be used in timber and carbon and landscape scale, anything really. Pest detection, burn severity, landscape scale management or conservation. The applications are pretty unlimited, but so now GSI has recently released a product called ForINT. And we talk about that problem where there's a really high fixed cost to this type of analysis. So how can we make this type of data more accessible? And that's really what ForINT is. So what GSI has done is pre-processed an entire area of the United States, a whole bioregion from East Texas down to, out to Georgia and then up to basically Delaware. We've pre-processed a 35-year harvest history of all the plantation forestry in the whole Southeast. So that real productive region. And now the logic behind that is if we can process that up front, we can then make it more accessible because it allows us to take smaller slices of that data and sell it in smaller packages. And that way a smaller landowner could use this, or this data can be turned around really quickly. Like in the event of a potential acquisition, you may have 4 to 6 weeks to make a bid. That's not really enough time to go cruise someone else's property, and who knows if you'll be able to get access to it. We've also got some interest from carbon, where folks are doing feasibility studies and trying to compare one potential property to another, or one potential project to another, prospecting into new areas. That's a real big chunk of work. And so ForINT would give them a head start by really having a bunch of data on this shelf that they could just go and reference about a particular geography, rather than have to go back and comb through the imagery and do some sort of analysis themselves.
Yeah,
So
very cool.
yeah, that's a pretty short overview of GSI, but happen to go into any detail that you'd like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for providing that overview, Frank. And I think I always like to joke. I try and channel our audience and listeners and read their questions. Be a mind reader. So I know you made the comment that it's what you get from LiDAR, but 30% more cost effective. And so for our listeners that for many maybe larger forestry companies, LiDAR is the default, a couple million acres, they'll fly that. Maybe smaller landowners, there's traditional cruising as they're trying to build their inventories. And so when you say it's like LiDAR today, when we look at the market, there's been some movement where there's some roll up where there's a couple players that provide individual tree inventories. So when you say it's like LiDAR for our listeners, how can we connect the GSI story with that LiDAR vocabulary of area-based inventories or pixels or individual tree inventories or tree lists and stuff like that? What can you say on that front to help us figure out? Because I've heard that pixel, and I just want to make sure that myself and our listeners really get what GSI is doing so they can contextualize how it could benefit some of their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. So GSI has a core process centered around Sentinel-2 imagery. Sentinel-2 is a satellite constellation put out by the European Space Agency. It has a 10-meter resolution, so that means every pixel represents 10 meters on the ground. And that satellite's, well, publicly available nature, and just in terms of cost saving, plus the revisit time of 5 to 6 days, makes it a really good data source for this landscape scale analysis. So LiDAR surveys might absolutely have higher resolution. if you're doing individual tree determinations, then yeah, that's what the application is for. GSI can ingest that type of data too. So if we're talking really wide areas where maybe there's portions of LiDAR data available. I mean, we'll essentially train our models with any reference data that's available in the standard approach that involves a 2003 U.S. Forest Service species map. It's 30-meter resolution. It's pretty old, but it at least gives the supercomputing models an idea of what they're looking at. And there are many different iterations to fold in ground data. So the LiDAR species predictions, as far as I know, are kind of based on geometry of the point cloud. And you need a certain density in order to have certain accuracy. Those can be maybe 70 to 80% accurate from what I've understood. So with the number that I presented earlier, looking at a 95% accuracy plus or minus 5% or 95% confidence level interval is what I should say. That there's a considerable difference there, and that's not to say that everything is perfect with time series analysis, because sometimes different species may get confused with each other, and in complex forests these are real challenges, especially overstory understory. um, but there's always a ground component on our project side. So we do projects, and we've just recently started with ForINT producing a product. And the project approach is bespoke. So although that's our core approach that I described, some forestry companies, most of their foresters have drones, and every time they go out, they just fly an image. And so there may be catalogs of data accessible in any given project. And I think that, like, you hinted earlier about, like, whoa, technology and forestry, what's that? Um, there is this kind of, it's almost like maybe forestry got a little burned at some point. Late 80s, early 90s, remote sensing came in pretty hot, promised a lot of things about itself and its capabilities. And we're talking about an industry that's been working in the woods with a clipboard and pen and paper, and they're getting a pretty accurate representation of what's in their forest, and they're making management decisions off of that. We're talking about two really large quantities of money in terms of some of the large landowners, or even just a large parcel. There's the value of the land and the value of the timber. So there's almost an emotional component to, well, I've been doing this on pen and paper, and it's not perfect for a long time, but it's at least predictable. And that makes me comfortable. And folding in new technology to the mix, it can be a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we've gone a long way from what's the difference between that and LiDAR, but this is a method that brings in ground data. And we're bringing in a local forester and a forest biometrician on every project. And that means that there's someone who knows the local conditions. And then there's also someone whose really whole career is based off of taking ground data and making it make sense in terms of what's in a forest. And we design a ground survey to complement the remote sensing analysis. So we're pre-stratifying the forest, and then we're assigning points to each strata rather than laying out a grid. So you can have a much faster ground survey in terms of, and a much less intensive. If you're visiting all your plots every 5 years, then you survey only 20% of those plots and get the same results. You can get a temporal resolution on your inventory of every year as opposed to every 5.
Right.
So that's some of the work that GSI is doing. I mean, it varies from case to case on the project basis, but also a lot of work in carbon now too.
Right, right. So it doesn't sound like, the GSI, vision, if that's the case, is to say, we're gonna like get down to that individual tree and know everything about it, as opposed to we're gonna leverage our multi-temporal technology know-how of how to look at this pixel and how it evolves through time to create maps, typically on a pixel resolution basis, driven by boots on the ground data or drone data. So that makes sense to me. And I guess thinking of the typical customer, is there a sweet spot that you folks have found? I know you mentioned folks that were maybe looking at doing some acquisitions or maybe that carbon space, but is there like in that forestry space, is there an ideal customer profile for you that you've kind of nailed and said, yeah, this is the sweet spot, and yeah, we can just crank this out? Or is it still, because it's forestry, it depends on what's going on in the world and foresters' needs are. What are your thoughts on that? Is there like that sweet spot in that North American side, and does that change when you go globally to other jurisdictions? Because I suspect when you talk about that multi-temporal time series, that analysis, that can be powerful in other jurisdictions beyond just North American commercial forestry or forestry in general. What do you think about that?
Yeah. To be honest, uh, it's the two different approaches have two different kind of segments, and absolutely there is an element that the folks that can afford this type of approach on the project level are folks who own very large swaths of land. If you take the top 10 forest managers by acreage in the United States, GSI has worked with a handful of them, and uh, that is a typical in terms of like the customer profile, because they're the folks who need the insights on these very large swaths of land. In carbon, there is a little bit different demand. I think a lot of these, a lot of carbon project developers are a little bit more startup like, where a lot of the major players in forestry have been along a very long time. They're big corporations. They might have some people within the organization that are looking at how to fold technology in better, but it's as compared to some of the carbon project developers and the small startup environment, maybe a lot of them coming from technology anyway, they're very tech forward. And certainly some smaller carbon project developers in terms of feasibility studies. Um, Also, anybody that's looking at acquiring or divesting of some sort of forest land, having the data to improve either buyer confidence or to improve one's own confidence in the event of an acquisition to confirm the data that a seller is providing. Um, Within the United States, the company has done a very significant amount of work in the United States. And I think that, largely stems from, I think, just the development of the industry in the United States and the extent of the timber producing capacity here. There are there's also a decent amount of publicly available data. A considerable aspect of our approach is bringing in FIA data, so forest inventory and analysis from the U.S. Forest Service. We're actually just getting data that's kind of that helps calibrate the remote sensing models on a very landscape scale. Chances that we're going to get FIA plots that are within a client property are pretty low, but we're actually analyzing a wider area when we're doing the analysis regardless. So we're able to get some ground calibration there. There's just a decent amount of data, and the company's developed a predictable process in the United States, and that can be replicated elsewhere, but we're navigating different programs in different countries in terms of what publicly available data there might be. Sometimes it's not worth it to venture down that step. It's best to just design a ground survey that's right on the client's property, or maybe throughout the area if there's access to larger areas. So it can vary. The company's bespoke approach really it's what clients have. When I really actually, so I joined GSI in December of 2023, so a little bit less than a year ago now. And when I first joined and was learning about the company, one thing that I heard from clients a lot was, well, the team at GSI, I really appreciated how they were able to empower me to make my own decisions about the trade-offs I'm going to face in my remote sensing analysis. So GSI doesn't have a relationship with a particular data provider, so they can be pretty agnostic in terms of, well, what are your needs? What are your limitations? What's the type of data that you're trying to get? And let's take a reasonable approach and maybe come up with a few different scenarios. If you need high resolution on a certain element, and again, if a client were to say, we need a tree by tree solution on this particular area, I mean, that's a lot in terms of being able to scale out to tens of millions of acres. So really, like, what's the right balance between the data that you can use? Are you looking for publicly available data first to save on cost? Are you okay with a private acquisition? It really there's many different considerations that come into the project approach, but typically a client's experience is they might come to us with a challenge and or some sort of remote sensing data that they might be interested in, and they will meet first with me, and then I'll bring in other members of the team. There's a really deep team at GSI, Masters of Science, PhD level in Earth observation, remote sensing, forestry, kind of depending upon different folks' expertise, different people will get pulled in. And by the time the project goes into production, we've probably had 3 or 4 meetings in which, the client's learning about the different types of data that are available, the trade-offs that using each would present them, potential uncertainties that could be encountered later down the road. And in most every remote sensing project, you're going to encounter uncertainties. There may be poor coverage of a certain geographic area in some type of data that you need. But really, GSI is going to be the team behind you to say, okay, well, uh, here's this uncertainty that you will have and you would have encountered regardless of, whatever method you chose to undertake this.
Right.
So let's help you navigate that.
Right.
Let's help you understand the implications. And at some point, the law of diminishing returns kick in. It's no longer viable to be spending more money on better data because, you've gotten maybe close to where you want to be. And the amount of money that you're going to get out if you're a timber manager of uh, the project is not longer the difference in learning more information that you spend versus what you get is not worth it anymore.
Right.
So kind of like guiding clients as to when it's probably an appropriate time to tap out is another thing that GSI can do.
Right.
Um,
So it's like you provide that advisory side of things along with that bespoke remote sensing service. And so you mentioned that ForINT was almost like producing that data product and be able to resell it on a per acre basis. And so as we talk about costs is, and I'm sure you're asked this at these last two events that you're at, Frank, but how much does it cost? Like is there a set thing you can share with us on ForINT where you're like, yeah,
yeah,
it's like if you want 1,000 acres, this is what it costs. It's per unit. Is there something fixed there, or does it depend?
yeah. So it depends. So Forint has very wide coverage. It's a really tremendous area. Again, yeah, East Texas down to Georgia, all the way up to Delaware. Um, Somebody could purchase that entire area, and obviously there's an economy of scale there. But for making it accessible, a minimum engagement is 7,500 US dollars.
Eh,
So someone that's looking to perform a quick check on, what's present in the property, that becomes very accessible. Now, in terms of how it scales, pricing could be anywhere from 10 cents an acre down to a penny per acre. It really just
Very
depends
cost
on the
effective.
area.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It really depends upon the area, the volume, and sometimes there are custom features that a client might want, and we could make some tweaks on top of that foreign data.
Yeah.
But the standard offering is an update every year. So currently, up until 2023 is what's available now. In just a couple of months, we'll have the 2024 annual harvest and thinning data available, site index, and that's kind of an annual refresh. So there's the 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 data up front. We can do just a single year. If you want the whole 35-year history, that's fine too. It really allows us to kind of select from the data where a client's needs might be and not have to worry about any of those high fixed costs.
Yeah. And so
So
thinking of our foresters who range, as we know, from the um, less sophisticated to the very sophisticated. How do you deliver these data products, whether it's a bespoke project or whether it's foreign? Is it we're gonna send you a drive, or is there some web services that the in the know how to consume it? What have you found in terms of that sweet spot in delivering this data? Because I assume for some areas they can be significant or the task call up could be quite big that you know having a simple way to get the data to people probably makes sense. What does GSI have as their default de facto delivery platform?
yep. So there's two actually. One is our own platform. So we have a web-based platform. It's really meant to make the volume of data accessible, easily interpretable. So you just get a login to that. All the data is there. Um, you can zoom around. There's many different panes that you can cycle through. You can duplicate panes and look at side by sides of different data layers. It's an easy visualization tool. To get really deep into the data, though, we do provide the full files. That's just really a file download through Basecamp. So clients get both. They get this visualization platform that they can call up really quickly, dive into the data, maybe make an initial query, and then know maybe what if they have access to a large slice of the data off the shelf, then they will know exactly where in that data set to go to cut out an area that's relevant to their project, so they're not working with that whole data set. Um, Sometimes a client may just for if it's a quick like appraisal confirmation or a quick acquisition due diligence, then the web-based platform might be enough. But clients, have the ability to retain that data and work with it in any way that they see fit in the future. So if they want to combine the analyses that GSI produced with some or their other sort of proprietary analyses or compare an inventory to something prior, it's all on the table for them. And really, actually, it just depends upon the level of in-house GIS expertise.
Yeah, yeah. So thinking of, I believe like from the SAF or Society of American Foresters event, ForINT is something that's relatively new. So what is the reception been to date? Because you've gone to a couple events, I'm sure many more events to hit and share the story of what GSI is doing. But to date, what's been the response so far to the ForINT product and maybe even folks getting reacquainted with GSI? What's the response been to those products?
Yeah, it's been very well. And I think having that 35-year harvest history for everywhere in the whole Southeast, that's something that, especially folks that are looking at market scale, that's not a piece of information that they've had access to previously. And so that is like for me, kind of coming into GSI, it's like, oh yeah, this is actually really, really cool. Um, GSI is doing some pretty cutting edge stuff in terms of being able to process wide volumes of data over very big areas.
Yeah.
And the reception, I think, has been there's this dynamic again between the timber industry and the carbon companies, where carbon companies are actively looking for technological solutions to make themselves more efficient, and that's really like the organization as a whole. And in timber companies, they're certainly looking for technology, and maybe it's not timber, maybe there's REITs, TIMOs. There's the kind of dynamics throughout the industry in terms of their readiness for technology and bringing technology into their organization just kind of varies.
Yeah.
Um, so there's been interest from timber, from the kind of TIMO REIT organization and wood products, and then there's interest also from carbon. And some of the cases overlap, some of them don't. In carbon, there's a lot of feasibility studies, dynamic baseline. So the American the Carbon Registry ACR, they released an update to their methodology for improved forest management carbon projects. And there's a lot of folks that are, kind of wondering how to adapt their systems and processes to accommodate this new methodology. And ForINT, although we weren't aware of these changes to the methodology when we started developing the platform or the data, um, the data is there, and we're actively working to examine what maybe simple tweaks and features can really have a concrete workflow for folks that are engaged in this type of challenge. So, um, you know, those that have their own GIS departments, they're able to affect a lot of these analyses themselves. Really, I think a key there is speed too. If you're getting many inquiries from potential partners every week, how do you weed through those projects properly and look at the feasibility if you've got limited resources?
Yeah.
So that's probably a rundown of the different types of inquiries. And then, there's also folks that are interested in kind of market-wide analyses, uh, whatever that might be in terms of mill to mill, what's being harvested when, looking at macroeconomic market conditions. There's potentially a lot of different uses for the data, and it's really going to be interesting to have conversations with all the different clients that are coming forward to really understand, their interest in it.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. And so with the time that we have left, I guess I wanted to see, um, again, sounds like there's a lot of, I always call them the brain trust, is back in HQ and always thinking about different things. And technology, as you know, is constantly evolving. Even when we look up in the sky, right, there's always stuff getting launched in there. There's hyperspectral, there's all sorts of new technologies that are being launched. What's GSI thinking about? And I know you're in the seat of the VP sales, not the CTO seat, and there's other folks there, but I also suspect in your seat, you all talk about, what's coming next or where you want to focus your resources and energies as GSI and add more value and services and capture more of the market. But is there a certain technology, a certain theme? Like today, the EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation, there's talk about it being delayed, 12 months. And with GSI in Edinburgh, Scotland, I'm assuming they're watching that because, again, it's that temporal component that I heard, that time series analysis IP that you have there that I would assume would fit into that world very nicely. But from a technology point of view, what are those things that you guys are thinking about and keeping an eye on, given where you are today and thinking, man, if this could comes online or this new problem with this newer technology solved, this can really take our engine, our GSI engine to the next level.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few different things that come to mind. Uh, One would be advancements in satellite technology. There's companies out there doing cool things with micro constellations. So lots of little satellites and data that's available more frequently and a higher resolution than the Sentinel-2. That becomes really interesting to think about what you're going when you're going from a 10-meter pixel to a 1-meter pixel, and that becomes more economically accessible. Because that's really the prohibition right now is cost that a lot of these micro constellation data providers are it's pay to play. So to work on a budget, we're working with publicly available data. That's not to say that we couldn't work with this type of data, and we could ingest all different types of data, and that actually comes to another point that's really interesting. There's lots of technology. I listened to your podcast with Eli Jensen. I met Eli at a SAF conference back in February, and have kept in touch. And the type of work that he's doing is really cool because um, well, from a couple of different perspectives, he's, I guess for a recap, if anybody hasn't listened to that episode, it's basically a backpack unit with a mobile LiDAR, 360-degree camera, some drones, and there's both of those options. It's not just Eli. There's companies out there doing this too. So for your ground-based survey, you're collecting ground data, but doing that with a device that's taking a three-dimensional twin. And there's an interesting component of that because GSI, we work with a biometrician and a local forester on every project to design a ground survey. And that ground survey is really what attunes the remote sensing models to be accurate. And if there were to be a digital representation of each plot, that is, and also like really tied to an accurate GPS location, that's really interesting. I think when I look at carbon too, something with carbon is that it's a little bit nebulous to the folks that are buying the credits, right? So how do I know that the forest that I'm buying a credit that's supporting it actually exists, that you know the ground data isn't being flubbed, or they're not harvesting when they say, or they are harvesting when they say they are not. um and the ground component of that is currently just an Excel spreadsheet, a tree list. And we do produce a estimated a tree list per stand for every stand in our inventories. But imagine if that ground data could be something that you could click into. And as a third party credit buyer who doesn't really know forestry, say, well, I know that there is a plot where ground data is being measured, and that's supporting the calculations that are being made that support the credit that I'm buying. And I can go in and click into that three-dimensional twin area of that ground location. That's going to be a much more higher dollar value credit. People are now being able to distinguish between high quality carbon credits and those that are necessarily, using maybe not necessarily low quality, but using coarser data to come to the uh, claims about what the project is doing. So I think that's a really interesting thing, I think, for me personally. And you go to conferences and you see this technology being deployed, and it's really fascinating. Um, so yeah, I'd say that those are two topics that come to mind pretty readily.
Yeah, very cool. No, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, love to hear that. You know, part of doing this digital forester podcast is really just to kind of raise that awareness, that education amongst that digital forester community. So love to hear the cross fertilization of people who have come on this podcast. So we're at time as we look to wind down, Frank. We can talk forever. I can sense that already and go left, right, center. But as we look to wind down, for folks that are listening to your story and what GSI does, what's the best way for folks to follow up with you? Or is it a LinkedIn thing? Is it a website? Is it email? Or what's the best way if someone wants to follow up and chat with you about whether a bespoke option or ForINT and how they can go ahead and make a purchase and retrieve that data?
Sure. Well, yeah. First of all, there is a publicly available demo of Forint online. You can find it at ForINT, ForINT. That's ForINT for Forest Intelligence, and forint.ai. There'll be a link to the demo right there. You can just go check that out and play around with it to your heart's content. Anyone wants to reach out to me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is /fmastro, but if you just search my name, which I know might be a tall order, you can certainly find me. And then Frank at surfaceintelligence.com is my email. You can just drop me a line there. I'm happy to engage in any conversation. I think folks at GSI are a resource regardless of if there's a commercial engagement or not. If someone on the team doesn't know the answer, then a pretty good chance we could point you in the right direction. So as always, feel free to reach out.
Very cool. So the last question I have to maybe bring us full circle to that journey that you described that got you to GSI and the work you're doing there. I'm dying to know. Someone, your family, mom, dad was a EMT, doctor, forester, salesperson, something that got you on this path, or no, I'm missing the target completely.
Yeah, my mother was a special ed administrator, and she really just kind of encouraged me when I was young. Um, just my love of nature. I can remember when I was really young. I grew up not far away from the University of Rhode Island's Bay campus, and they had lectures on Alvin, the submersible in the early 90s. I can remember her taking me to those. And yeah, like the Guide to Rhode Island's Natural Places book I mentioned, that's one that, she got me. And um my father he works at really a seafood commodities company, just large quantities of scallops, bought and sold frozen scallops mostly, and also a sociologist. He's a adjunct professor at Roger Williams University, and I think that kind of my path was probably a bit my own. Um, it At least it feels that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I, I,
Your
I,
parents might have a different view, by the way. They might say, "Oh, we nurtured Frank and guided him in these different ways. This was the outcome, right?" As they always do. But at the same time, doesn't surprise me hearing that. You know, it sounds like parents that were really encouraging you to explore, go out and play, go out and discover and learn, and listening to your journey and where you are now. To some extent, you're actually carrying on, continuing your learning, exploring new ideas. You know, challenging the status quo. So it kind of fits really nicely. So yeah. So, hey, man, it was great to meet you. I know we've never kind of met in person, just through social media. We got connected. Love this story. Thanks so much for sharing more about GSI and what you do. And for the folks that want to get a hold of Frank, he gave you the details. There's forint.ai if you want to learn more about the forint product there. And if you want to reach a hold of him, you can find him on LinkedIn there. And Frank, thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to maybe meeting you one day and chatting more into the future.
Thanks, Kevin. Really appreciate you.
Awesome. Good stuff. Bye for now.